Hello everybody, it's Gwiglet here, back again with another video on Macbeth. Today we're going to be looking at the plot itself to Shakespeare's play, and I will be giving you a key quote in each of the acts, just to help you get you on your way. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'm a teacher of over 10 years experience and in English language, English literature, so this channel will help to build your understandings at GCSE, at A-level and beyond of what is the best subject that we teach at school. So, exam success, understanding Macbeth, lesson 2 and plot. Feel free to pause, take notes as you go, and without further ado, let's begin. So, a couple of key tips I would recommend in terms of studying Macbeth, particularly getting to know the plot. The first, and probably the most important, would be to not worry too much about the language at first. A number of students I've taught in my time get very much caught up in the these, the thys, the thous of the language of Shakespeare's time, and it can seem much like an obstacle. My advice would be just try to put that to one side at first. Try to just know the plot in the same way you'd understand the plot of a novel, the plot of a film, or the plot of a TV series you may be watching. It's just getting to know the basic plot is the first key ingredients to actually helping your work expand and improve, and your understanding as well. My second tip is this: to know Macbeth the character is to know Macbeth the play. What I mean by this is, in this instance, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the character Macbeth has or is referred to in well over possibly 70% of the lines, I would suggest, in the play. So much of the play revolves around him that if you know the character of Macbeth, if you know how he progresses and his ultimate downfall, you cannot go wrong. So start with him, and if you understand where he goes and where he ends up, then by and large you'll have a very, very strong footing in terms of going forward with the play itself. And just to add to this, watch as many different versions as you can. The play has been around for centuries, as we said in our first video. The play was first performed in the early 17th century, and with that there are so many different film versions you could watch at the theatre recordings and productions. See as many as you can possibly see, and in doing so that will only help to nurture and develop your understanding of the play itself. So let's begin. We're looking at Act 1, and I'm going to be giving you a whistle-stop tour of the play itself and what happens in every act, as I said before, with one key quote per act, just to help you get you on your way with that as well. The play begins with the witches. The witches are on the battlefield and they're hatching their plan, in their own words, to meet with Macbeth. That's really important, not only because of the fear that an audience would have had on witches, as we know before, but it's also important because they're on the battlefield. The play begins and ends on a battlefield, but it's also further more important because they're choosing to meet with Macbeth. Macbeth becomes their puppet on a string. They are the ones that orchestrate and arguably create the downfall, the rise and downfall of Macbeth in this play. In the meantime, a civil war is raging in Scotland. King Duncan of Scotland is having his crown and his leadership contested by MacDonald, Thane of Cawdor, and the invading forces of Norway. Macbeth, as well as Banquo and many other generals, or Thanes, as they are known in this play, are the defending forces. They are successful and victorious. Macbeth is a hero at the beginning of the play. We have to remember that. Macbeth is very much the good guy, in blunt terms, and Duncan praises him. Duncan is very effusive in his praise and rewards him with effectively a promotion to the role of Thane of Cawdor for helping to suppress the civil war and help Duncan to win it. As we continue, we have the first encounter with the witches. Banquo and Macbeth are coming back from the battlefield and they come face to face with the witches. Prophecies at this point are told. The witches tell Banquo that though he will not be king, he shall have kings. By that they mean that his children shall be the ones to inherit the throne. And Macbeth is told that though he will not have kings, he shall become king. And he shall also become Thane of Cawdor before that. Thane is like a general or a lord, a very powerful person in the era. They're told these prophecies, and then it is announced that Macbeth will be made Thane of Cawdor, so they are all of a sudden surprised and shocked and alarmed by this. Macbeth begins to wonder just how true the witch's prophecies are. And in doing so, there is the beginnings in Macbeth's mind of a plot and a possible plan to take the crown. As the act continues, Duncan pronounces his son Malcolm to be the Prince of Cumberland, which is in effect the heir to the crown. Okay, so in this point of the play, we find out that it's Malcolm that is due to be the next king. Now, obviously, in Macbeth's position, this creates confusion and questions because the witches have told him he will be king. Now, the interesting point here is, and what we have to understand is, that this is where Macbeth starts to increase this sense of plotting and scheming in terms of getting the crown. At the end of the act, he sends a letter to Lady Macbeth telling her about what the witches have told him, and telling her about how Duncan is planning to come to their castle that night in an act of celebration at the end of the war. Lady Macbeth helps to motivate or manipulate, depending on your perspective, Macbeth, and they plan to kill Duncan under their roof that night. Lady Macbeth will drug the guards that are protecting Duncan at night, and Duncan, in his sleep, will be murdered by Macbeth. So my first key quote would be this, and it's from Lady Macbeth. There are many important quotes, but I think this is the first one to really help you on your way. It comes from Act 1, Scene 5, and Lady Macbeth says, "I fear he is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way." What Lady Macbeth is saying here is that Macbeth is inherently too good, too full of the milk. We think of milk as in, not only fortifying one's bones, but growth, okay, in a natural, pure sense. The milk of human kindness, that Macbeth is too pure, Macbeth is too moral, Macbeth is too virtuous to do things that are more evil, more amoral, if he is to truly become the king. So that's Lady Macbeth's quote there in Act 1, Scene 5, and that's my quote of the act. She's saying here how she thinks he's just too nice, he's too good, and it's her manipulations that help him to come around to the idea of regicide, the murder of King Duncan. We continue into Act 2 now, and in this, Macbeth, who is very much tortured, he's beginning to fray mentally, break apart. He hallucinates as he's waiting for the signal to enter Duncan's bedchambers, that his guards are drugged. He hallucinates that he sees a dagger, hence the famous line, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" He sees a dagger covered in blood. He sees the actual act of what he's about to do. He starts to think about how the supernatural is starting to rise from the earth. He's very much in an intense state of conflict and anxiety at what's about to happen. Lady Macbeth, having now drugged the guards, rings the bell rather, and Macbeth goes about to do the deed. He assassinates Duncan. Now there's a number of different layers you have to understand about this. Duncan is the king, which means in turn he is God incarnate in the understanding of the play itself at this point. Duncan is old and frail, he is asleep, he is vulnerable, he is the King of Scotland, therefore the manifestation of God. He is murdered, hence the term regicide for the formal term of the murder of a monarch, but also it's where he's murdered, under the roof of the man that's sworn to protect him. There's so many levels of treachery here that when Macbeth fears that he's lost his soul, he has true, legitimate reason to believe that. So in the assassination of Duncan, Macbeth loses a part of himself because there's so many layers of treachery. Lady Macbeth then returns to find Macbeth traumatised from this act. He can't go back into the room. He brings the daggers out with him by accident that were meant to lie with the guards to frame them. Lady Macbeth scolds him, calls him infirm of purpose. She goes back and puts the daggers in there because Macbeth, remember, a man who is a brutal warrior, can't go back in there and face what he's done. We see his mind begin to crack and fray. From here, the next day, Duncan's body is discovered by Banquo and the other generals. Fearing for their lives, Duncan's two sons, Malcolm, the former heir of Scotland, and Donalbain flee to separate countries to save their lives, leading to a power vacuum in Scotland, where there is no one there to take the throne, leading Macbeth to naturally slip in and become king. My quote for this act Well, it goes without saying. Is this a dagger I see before me? Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 1, with one of the most probably quotable, memorable lines in the entire play. We begin to see this hallucination and subsequent degradation, falling apart of his mentality and his mind. Now, moving forward into Act 3. At the beginning of Act 3, Macbeth is made king. Now this increases Banquo's suspicions. Remember, the only other person to have seen the witches and to know of the witches beyond Lady Macbeth is Banquo. So he has every reason to suspect that all of a sudden Duncan's dead, Macbeth was made Thane of Cawdor, Malcolm and Donalbain have fled, and now we have him as king. In Banquo's own words in Act 3, Scene 1, I fear thou playedst most foully for it. So he has a fear there and a suspicion as a result. With this, Macbeth knows he cannot trust Banquo any longer, and he also resents the idea that Banquo's children will become the kings. So Macbeth has Banquo murdered while he is out riding in the evening with his son. However, his son Fleance escapes. Banquo dies, but his son is dead. Now, that evening, at a banquet held to cement the power of Macbeth as the king, he begins to see the ghost of Banquo, and he begins to mentally fall apart here. He begins to shout and scream at an empty chair where he should be sitting at the chair of the king, very poignant considering that's where Banquo's ghost is seen. Lady Macbeth castigates and mocks him for this, because Lady Macbeth doesn't know this has happened. Lady Macbeth was not involved in the plan to murder Banquo, it should be said. And we leave the play at this point in the act, we leave at the end of Act 3 with Macbeth falling apart and having to speak to the witches again to make sure that his power is consolidated. He is a man very paranoid and a man who needs to know more. So the quote for Act 3 here would be, upon my head they placed a fruitless crown. Macbeth says this in Act 3, Scene 1, and he's referring to the witches. He's referring to the kind of resentment and the depression he subsequently feels. He feels that, as with many monarchs, for those of you that know your history, it wasn't just good enough to be a king or a queen. You had to consolidate your legacy. You had to consolidate your dynasty, as it were. Now Macbeth is saying here, it's all well and good to have a crown, but for him it's fruitless. And by the term fruitless, he's using this in a metaphorical sense to denote the fact that he has no children. You know, what's the point in him being king if he can't pass it on to an heir and have the Macbeth name and legacy passed down for generations? So we see this level of depression and resentment in Macbeth in private quarters that he doesn't show outwardly. Moving on now into Act 4, we have one of the turning points of the play where Macbeth returns to the witches. He demands to know more from them. He has to have his fears allayed, and they tell him 3 new prophecies. First of all, they tell him to beware Macduff. Nothing more, nothing less, just beware Macduff. Secondly, no man of woman born can harm Macbeth. So that gives him a lot of confidence. He feels a sense of invincibility as a result of this. And the third and final prophecy, that Macbeth will remain and be king until Burnham Wood, the adjacent forest to Dunsinane, his own castle, moves to Dunsinane. These are the 3 prophecies. Now there is an element of trickery here, or known as sophistry, in what they say, which will become clear later on in the play. However, at this result, and at this point, Macbeth is very much buoyed in confidence by what they have told him. So he orders, as a result of the first prophecy, the murder of the entire Macduff family. We see this tyrannical edge come out in Macbeth. We see him end up becoming almost this dictator. He asks for them all to be wiped out, women and children included. However, Macduff himself is in England, persuading Malcolm to return to take his claim to the throne, as Macbeth has been destroying Scotland, and Scotland has been suffering while he has been king. He is successful in persuading Malcolm. However, while he is there, he learns that his entire family are dead, and he swears revenge. Now here we see the undoing of this first prophecy. The witches tell him to beware Macduff. However, in telling him to beware Macduff, Macbeth has set up his own doom, because by eliminating his family, Macduff now swears to personally put Macbeth to the sword, that he will not rest until it's him himself who has slain Macbeth. So we see that first prophecy coming undone. Now our quote of the act here would be this from Macbeth. Give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls. His being Macduff. And we see this particularly in this phrase, his wife, his babes. Macbeth has gone from murdering kings and adults to murdering children. We see the descent of Macbeth's mind, and we see the extent of his tyranny and dictatorship, which is really telling here. Very important point as we move on to the final act. So in the act that concludes the play, we begin with Lady Macbeth sleepwalking and talking openly about the crimes that she and Macbeth have committed. One of her chambermaids and a doctor who has come to assess her illness hear this, and they are shocked by the revelation she's been saying. We see how traumatized she is and how traumatized she has become, and she eventually takes her own life as a result. This happens off stage in the play, and Macbeth, when he hears, is quite distant about it. We see that there's been a real separation since he plotted the murder of Banquo between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. Moving forward, Malcolm's forces gather outside Dunsinane for battle. The war is set. Malcolm has come to reclaim his throne, and Macbeth is fortified Dunsinane. Macbeth, on the other hand, is still inherently fearless and confident. He says, "Our outward banners would laugh a siege to scorn." He says that Dunsinane he could be here for centuries. He could be here for as long as he wanted, solely for the fact that the witches have told him these prophecies, and as a result, he feels as he says in Act 5, "I bear a charmed life." He feels that he is fueled by the prophecies of the witches. As a military tactic, Malcolm's forces decide to chop down the trees of Birnam Wood to disguise their numbers to Macbeth's forces. Now here we see the third of the prophecies start to come undone, that the woods move. In chopping down Birnam Wood and trees and the branches, the army themselves begin to move, and it makes it look like the woods are moving. So we see this element of sophistry coming through again, this treachery through wordplay. This starts to shake Macbeth, but he still feels slightly invulnerable. It then comes to the point where he fights Macduff. And as he fights Macduff, he has the better hand at first. He says, as I mentioned earlier, that "I bear a charmed life." He doesn't feel that he's going to lose. It's only when Macduff says, Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. He was born by caesarean. So when the witches say that no man of woman born can harm Macbeth, in a technical sense, Macduff wasn't naturally born. He was born in a medical operation that would have ensured that he was out in time and didn't die. So that shows how the wordplay of the witches again is tricking Macbeth. Macbeth realises that the witches have tricked him all along. He loses his confidence. He decides to fight to the end, but is ultimately slain by Macduff. And we finish the play with Malcolm being made the new King of Scotland. So that is the entire play. And we have one final quote. And this is from Macbeth. "I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked." How brutal the wordplay is here, hacked in the verb hacked and from my bones. Macbeth is going to go out as a soldier and a warrior just as he started. So there is a kind of doomed honour in Macbeth in what he does, because he, from the start, is a soldier that only knows the language of violence, and he ends up doing the very same, with his head chopped off by Macduff, going out fighting just like a soldier. We have the soldier at the beginning, the hero, and like any tragedy, as this is a tragedy, he starts as a noble soldier who becomes Thane of Cawdor, overreaches to become the king, and then we have this massive downfall that costs both him and his wife their lives. So that has been today's video lesson. Thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to leave a like. Please subscribe also as well. And feel free to share this among all your friends as well. Don't forget that we also have the Twitter @Gwiglet as well. And until next week, have a great week, and I will speak to you soon. Take care and all the very best.